despite the fact that through the course of the 20th century, millions of different cars have been built, most people will instantly be able to picture a Land Rover when they hear the name. This image may be of the original Series 1, or the infamous Range Rover. Whatever the model that springs to mind, it matters very little because few people would have ever believed that this stopgap post-war design would lead to the incredible longevity and popularity that the Land Rover name the world over has inspired. As a matter of fact, the incredible success of Land Rover has meant that these vehicles are now an essential part of the British landscape and a worldwide automotive phenomenon, tackling mountains, molehills, swamps and desert terrain with equal efficiency, proving there's no vehicle more desirable than a Land Rover when the odds are stacked against you. During their lifetime, these four-wheel drive vehicles that have become synonymous with the Land Rover name aren't only popular choices with everyday road users, but with farmers, scientists and even explorers. And thanks to its versatile design and off-road capabilities, the vehicles have become an absolute necessity for the military, so much so that by the new millennium they'd infiltrated markets in over 140 nations throughout the world. For many of their owners, Land Rover vehicles became much more than a car. They became a passport to adventure. And today we have the pleasure of exploring how and why Land Rover has become a modern-day legend. However, before we begin this fascinating journey, let's take a few minutes to consider the events that contributed to the invention of the very first Land Rover, the much-loved Series 1. As 1945 drew to a close, like many other nations, Great Britain was suffering the after-effects of the Second World War. The country faced financial ruin as its industries collapsed due to the shortage of raw materials and resources. Consequently, life in peacetime Britain was tough. A new government had brought about new hope with a promise to rebuild the British economy, but this wasn't going to be easy. In fact, they turned to the nation's car industry, one of the world's largest, to help put the country back on its feet, or perhaps wheels, depending upon your point of view. The government believed that if Britain's car manufacturers could design and mass-produce cars for sale on an international scale, the money brought in from foreign exports would help to revive the faltering economy. Up until this time, the Rover Company had produced some of the most affordable luxury cars in Britain, boasting high-quality prestige at a reasonable price, and Rover cars were extremely sought after. But because of the war, and the lack of money thereafter, the demand had all but dried up. So, with nothing to lose, Rover accepted the government's challenge. After seeking permission to restart civilian car production, the designers at Rover started work. The first idea that they came up with was a novel, small car design. But as soon as the engineers realised that steel supplies would continue to be rationed due to post-war shortages and allocated in accordance with the number of cars exported, they abandoned the plan and decided that the small car market was not going to be the way forward. With nothing else in the pipeline, Rover began mass-producing pre-war design cars at its newly acquired Solihull factory, in the hope that these cars would be good enough to export. However, the disappointing lack of British sales made it clear that these cars would struggle to be a worldwide success. if they wanted to help themselves and the government, while wisely avoiding bankruptcy. They needed something revolutionary, and they needed it urgently. With no time to waste, the chief engineers of the company, the Wilks brothers, attempted to come up with a vehicle that would be suitable to sell worldwide, yet realistically they felt that spectacular and innovative might be better executed when the company was stable and time would be on their side. Therefore, a vehicle that would simply act as a stopgap in the Rover range, providing a temporary solution until the raw materials for car production came off ration, was considered to be the most sensible option. The vehicle they came up with was fundamentally inspired by Maurice Wilks's great passion for farming, which was as vital to the recovery of post-war Britain as the car industry. At the time, Wilks, like many other farmers, was using an ex-Army Willys Jeep, but because of its tendency to break down, and even when going, its inability to double as a light tractor, he began to think about creating a Rover vehicle to replace it. Of course, at the time, there wasn't anything remotely suitable on the market that he could buy, so he decided to design his own replacement, one that would also very conveniently fill the gap in the market that Rover had been looking for. And so, born out of necessity, the Land Rover story begins, as does our journey for this programme with the eponymous Series 1. When Maurice Wilks brought his idea back to the engineers at Rover, he gave them very basic specifications. He told them he wanted this new car to be a Jeep-like, utilitarian, four-wheel drive vehicle that would also be versatile enough to use as a light tractor in the harshest of conditions, and what's more, it had to be suitable for everyday road transport as well. Tough as this design challenge was, in practical terms, the manufacturing process had to satisfy three more vitally important criteria. The car had to be simple in design, cheap to build, and require as little steel as possible. Maurice Wilks was asking a great deal of his team at Rover, but they immediately set to work. Using the Willys Jeep as a yardstick, the Rover employees had a good basic concept to work from, and the idea of using aluminium alloy for the car's bodywork instead of steel proved to be nothing short of inspirational. Not only was this a material that was easier to manipulate, but also it was of course far more readily available than steel. This meant that it would bring down the manufacturing costs dramatically and make the finished vehicle cheaper to buy. Equally, using aluminium alloy allowed them to design bodywork that was really quite simple, in that it only consisted of 3 separate panels, each of which could be easily and independently unbolted from the basic construction if required. The Series 1 was consequently both lightweight and more resistant to corrosion, which was an obvious advantage for a vehicle that was likely to spend most of its life in harsh conditions, an essential consideration if the Land Rover was going to make its mark in international markets. It It was an added bonus that this resistance to corrosion meant that the vehicles would have a much longer life than more traditionally constructed cars. Although Rover could opt for the soft aluminium alloy when it came to the bodywork, the chassis had to be made out of the strongest material possible, which, at the time, was steel. At that time, it was common practice to use heavy presses to create the individual parts that would fit together to become the chassis. But rather than use this tried and tested method, the Rover engineers came up with a new way, one that used heavy box sections of steel that had been welded together. It not only saved time and money, but far from being a low-quality, brittle chassis, it was both strong and durable. And just like the aluminium bodywork, the chassis design became recognised as a Land Rover trademark. Once the rest of the design was put together, work on a prototype began in the spring of 1947. Not long after this, a further 25 cars were produced, so that extensive testing could be carried out. It's quite remarkable that over half of these cars have survived more than 50 years and are still around to this day, some of them having been painstakingly restored by their devoted owners. With the Rover bosses more than happy with their finished product, all that remained was for the company to unveil their creation to the general public. And this is precisely what they did on April the 30th, 1948, at the Amsterdam Motor Show, when the Land Rover Series 1 officially went on sale. Looks-wise, it was hardly surprising that the car bore a distinct resemblance to the Jeep, but that's where any similarities ended. Beneath the paintwork, the Land Rover was a totally different car altogether. It featured a newly developed yet conventional 1595cc four-cylinder petrol engine, and a gearbox designed so that you could drive downhill, even mountainsides if you wanted to, with incredible ease. It was another milestone in the development that Land Rover would soon become famous for. The Series 1 also featured a cleverly designed, permanently engaged four-wheel drive transmission, which ensured that the tyre wear and tear was kept to a minimum. The leaf-strung suspension might have been a touch bouncy when the car was driven on tarmac, but in off-road conditions it was almost unbreakable. This characteristic made the Land Rover an ideal car for export to countries where most of the roads were dirt tracks and rough terrain. More importantly still, Maurice Wilkes's desire for a vehicle that could also double as a light tractor hadn't been forgotten, and the Series 1 was more than capable of fulfilling this requirement. However, what made the car even more appealing to the general public was its ingenious mechanical simplicity. Thanks to this, it was a car that saved you money, as you could repair and service it yourself, as long as you had a basic understanding of motor vehicles. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious that the new Series 1 was everything that Maurice Wilkes had wanted it to be, and much, much more besides. It was a no-nonsense, unpretentious, honest workhorse car with a well-defined purpose in life. This was a vehicle that was able to do its job well, and cosmetic considerations were far from paramount. In fact, the early Series 1s didn't even come with a roof and doors as standard, because they were optional extras. With no competition to speak of, it wasn't surprising that the Land Rover Series 1, a car years ahead of its time, sold well. Finally, British farmers had a car suitable for all their needs, and they quickly made the Land Rover a bestseller. Nevertheless, it wasn't just the farmers that liked this vehicle. The general public responded well to it, and almost immediately after its launch, hundreds of Series 1s were snapped up by the military. Painted in khaki with the characteristic short front, rear overhang and off-road capabilities, the Land Rovers were the perfect replacements for their now ageing World War II Jeeps. By the end of 1949, the pages of Autocar and Motor magazine were filled with special features on Rover's new creation, and even the daily newspapers wanted to get in on the act. Far from being the stopgap that Rover had envisaged it would be, the company had to double production just to cope with the demand. With the excellent response to the Series 1 in Britain, Rover decided to take the car to the USA and Canada to try and make it the popular export vehicle that it was originally intended to be. Unfortunately, sales were rather disappointing, and continued to be so throughout the 50s. But thankfully, it was a different story altogether when it came to the rest of the world, because despite the Americans being slow to take it, elsewhere the advantages of the Land Rover were more readily appreciated. In the 1950s, the motoring industry underwent considerable change as manufacturers began to realise that there was a growing demand for economical, small cars. This was great news for Rover because whilst car manufacturers were preoccupied with making micro and bubble cars, they didn't have the time or the inclination to produce any worthy competition for the Land Rover. So, with the 4x4 market all to itself for almost the whole decade, the Series 1 underwent minor changes. In 1950, a new metal roof was introduced, and 2 years later, the car got exterior door handles and side lights on the wing. By the end of 1953, the Land Rover was available with a larger 2-litre engine and a longer 86-inch wheelbase. Also on offer was the first long wheelbase model, and with a large number of rivets and non-matching side doors, it looked quite honestly as if it had just been thrown together. Nevertheless, at a very serviceable 107 inches in length, it sold well, and was exceptionally popular with people who needed either 4 doors or a greater carrying capacity, and after all, the Land Rover had never been renowned for its good looks. 1954 was a great year for Rover as the 100,000th Series 1 rolled off the assembly line, and the Land Rover name was rapidly becoming known for its durability and off-road capabilities. But perhaps even more importantly, the car was beginning to sell well in various countries across Europe, bringing in much needed money for the still recovering post-war economy. 3 years after the launch of the 86 and 107-inch wheelbase models, both gained an additional 2 inches and a new 2.2-litre petrol engine. Having achieved so much success already in both the British and European market, things continued to get better for Land Rover, especially when the emergency services bought hundreds of the 86-inch Series 1 models. Although the vehicles had to be adapted by specialist conversions, the Land Rovers made great fire engines and ambulances, and thanks to such all-weather off-road on-road performance, the Series 1 definitely helped to save many lives. In 1958, a new Land Rover variant was released, named logically but perhaps a little unimaginatively, the Series 2. And apart from a new 2.25-litre petrol engine, it wasn't incredibly different from the original. Nevertheless, this new variant continued to increase Land Rover's popularity both in the UK and Europe, and Rover were so pleased with both the sales figures and their satisfied customers that it remained virtually unchanged for 13 years, except for the occasional engine update, of course. By the time the 1960s started to swing, the variety of Land Rover options was only matched by the diversity of its customers and the uses to which they put them. The cars were fulfilling vital roles in the emergency services, and they were being used as recovery vehicles for the AA and RAC as well. From its humble beginnings as the farmer's friend, the Land Rover had grown in importance to play a crucial role in 20th century life. Keen to capitalise on this increasing popularity, Rover expanded its range of Land Rover products by creating a new variant called the Series 2A. By 1962, the Rover designers were busy listening to their customers' requests, and despite the fact that they'd increased the length before with the Series 1 long wheelbase Land Rover, their customers still asked for a car that had a greater carrying capacity. So by the end of the year, the Series 2A forward control was launched. It was basically a Series 2A with a long wheelbase 109-inch chassis, and it was available with a completed cab or as a rolling chassis. The car sold remarkably well, so much so that Rover struggled to keep up with demand, but rather than enjoying life on the open road, most of the forward controls ended up working for a living, either on the farm or as a public service vehicle. In fact, Rover were so happy with the way the new vehicle was selling that by 1966, the year that saw the 500,000th Land Rover built, they decided to upgrade the design further. The forward control gained a wider track, a slightly longer wheelbase of 110 inches, and a front anti-roll bar for even better stability. Meanwhile, on the export front, back in 1961, Rover had taken the Series 2A to North America in the hope that this would be the Land Rover that broke into the previously elusive US market. The decision to advertise it as a chic alternative to the homegrown American 4x4s seemed like a good idea. But the good citizens of the USA didn't share this view, and they simply didn't buy it. Undeterred, Rover went on the attack, and because of its UK and European success, they gave the Americans the Series 2A forward control. Thankfully, this model fared much better, and after a few years it became one of America's top sport utility vehicles. Now that Land Rover had finally been accepted in the US and was selling well in countries worldwide, a survey showed that the cars had no less than a third of the world's market for 4x4s. It seemed that finally Land Rover was starting to become the export car that both Rover and the British government had hoped that it would be. However, what was surprising was that the same survey highlighted that over 2/3 of Land Rover owners used their cars for recreational purposes, or, even more surprisingly, as everyday road transport, rather than exclusively for the more practical applications for which the car had originally been intended. It seemed as if things couldn't have been better for Land Rover. But by 1968, even greater success was on the horizon. Thanks to the car's versatility and ruggedness, not only had it cornered the mainstream market, but it also managed to satisfy the requirements of the military as well. The armed forces of most of the Western nations had now become important Land Rover customers, and business was booming. To maintain this stranglehold on the military market, 2 more Land Rover variants were created for exclusive sale to the armed forces. The first one was called the Lightweight and was basically a stripped-down Series 2A, which was suitable for air freighting into a war zone. When they entered service at the end of 1968, they were incredibly popular with the troops, and remained so until they were replaced with the Series 3 Lightweight in 1972. The second exclusive Land Rover was called the 101 Forward Control and was chosen in favour of another variant named the Middleweight. Yet despite 8 prototypes being made by the beginning of 1969, it wasn't until 1975 that the military started to use it, and by this time it had undergone radical changes since the design stage, the most noticeable being the 3.5-litre V8 engine. So far, The success that Land Rover had experienced in the 60s totally overshadowed how well it had sold in the 50s. But what's surprising is that it managed to achieve it in the face of worthy competition in the shape of BMC's Austin Gypsy. For 10 years, the Land Rover had managed to beat it hands down, and when Austin and Rover merged to form British Leyland Motor Corporation, the competition was scrapped. Near the end of the decade, the Land Rovers were given a 6-cylinder engine, and BLMC decided that it was time to give the car some creature comforts, one of which was well-upholstered front seats. However, the engineers thought that they could make the car even more luxurious, and with this in mind, they set to work on developing a brand new kind of Land Rover, one that wouldn't be based on the original Land Rover chassis or design. It was a car that would adopt the name Range Rover, and for the next section of this programme, we'll look at how this car, through the 70s and 80s, played a vital role in helping to keep Land Rover on course towards becoming a modern-day legend. The design brief for the new Land Rover was simple. It had to combine the comfort of a saloon car with the off-road capabilities that Land Rover had now become legendary for. To make this possible, one of the first things that the engineers at Solihull did was to give the Range Rover a brand new long-travel coil spring suspension, as this would offer car owners a much more sophisticated and comfortable on-road ride. They also decided to give the Range Rover a brand new engine, a 3.5-litre V8 monster to be precise, as well as a new transmission and 4-wheel disc brakes, which was something of a novelty at the time. The process from concept to production was swift, and on the 17th of June 1970 in Cornwall, the brand new 4-wheel drive Range Rover was launched. It was available with 2 doors and had an interior that could be hosed out for the die-hard enthusiasts who still insisted on using this new luxury model down on the farm. The Range Rover was a remarkable car that remained fundamentally unaltered for nearly 26 years, and it was only after this phenomenal time span that it was finally replaced by a more sophisticated version. Upon the Range Rover's launch, the board at British Leyland Motor Corporation waited anxiously to see what the British thought of their new car. But there was no cause for concern, as the reception that the Range Rover received was nothing short of amazing. Not only did the press give it wonderful reviews, but also virtually every report contained nothing but praise. Early indications suggested that the car would be an immense success, and sure enough, after only a few months, the company was swamped with orders, which they were of course delighted to supply. But despite its popularity with most of the car-owning public, there were a few hardcore Land Rover enthusiasts who thought the Range Rover couldn't possibly be as tough or as versatile as the original. However, in 1971, the car proved its off-road capabilities when it was driven by the British Army in the Trans-Americas Expedition, an event that no other vehicle had, to date, managed to finish. After a grueling 141 days of off-road jungle and swamp hell, the Range Rover completed the task. This remarkable achievement not only boosted sales, but it also added even more polish to Land Rover's already legendary reputation. In the early 1970s, this growing reputation for strength and durability attracted police attention for all the right reasons, and specially adapted Range Rovers were adopted as police vehicles. In fact, the UK's police forces were so happy with the car's performance that they used Range Rovers until the car was discontinued in 1996. Despite the Range Rover becoming the best-selling car in the Land Rover range, the Series 2A was still in demand, as many people still craved this simple, no-nonsense workhorse. In fact, BLMC thought that it would be worthwhile to upgrade it. And as a result, the Series 3 was created. On the outside, this new variant looked like its predecessor, but inside there were significant differences, as the main dials and switches were moved so that they were now in front of the driver. The car also featured more comfortable seats and was available in both short and long wheelbase formats, with various engine configurations and body styles. Although the Land Rover range was going from strength to strength in the British and European markets, the same couldn't be said for its North American market. In 1974, the Series 2As were losing out to better-powered homegrown trucks. Therefore, due to dwindling Land Rover sales, the company was left with no other choice but to once again withdraw from the American market. This was just the beginning of a whole run of problems to beset Land Rover, as behind the scenes, things weren't looking good for BLMC. By the end of the year, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, like many others in Britain, as a result of unemployment and industrial disputes. In fact, the company and Land Rover only survived because it was taken into government ownership. Despite trading difficulties, the Rover Group was created in 1978, and realising that the Range Rover was just as popular as ever, money was pumped into producing more of these classic vehicles to help keep the company afloat. Also, the Series 3 Land Rover, thanks to its rugged character, was as popular as ever with farmers and the military, which meant that the 4x4 part of the company got the attention it deserved, and instead of merely upgrading the car, the team at Rover Group decided to launch another Land Rover variant alongside it. The car was christened the Land Rover Stage 1 and was basically a long wheelbase Series 3 with a 3.5 litre engine, plus a unique front styling that combined the grille flush with the headlights. And as the Land Rover range rolled triumphantly into the 1980s, the new adaptation sold just as well as the Series 3 had previously. However, at the dawn of what was undoubtedly one of Land Rover's most glorious decades, the car market was beginning to change as vehicle owners demanded a much higher degree of luxury for their motoring. To satisfy their customers' demands, in 1981, engineers at the Solihull factory began developing an all-new upmarket four-door Range Rover that would include luxury trim and an automatic gearbox. Unfortunately, however, because the parent company was still recovering from financial problems, the public had to wait until 1983 to get their hands on this iconic car. Nevertheless, 1,000 Vogue Special Edition luxury Range Rovers were released, and within just a few weeks, all of them had been snapped up. While these specials were flying out of the showrooms, the classic Land Rovers, the Series 3 and the Stage 1, began to lose sales worldwide to the Japanese 4x4s that had now swamped the market. Efforts were made to rectify matters, and the design team worked on ways to compete with the Japanese. In 1983, the Series 3 was discontinued, but as the new Range Rover wowed customers worldwide, a new workhorse Land Rover was launched. The all-new Land Rover 110 represented something of a revolution, as it was the first classic Land Rover design to be produced with a coiled spring suspension, front disc brakes, improved setting, and a one-piece windscreen. It also combined the same basic styling as the series Land Rovers, with the latest in technological advances. Initially, this new Land Rover was only available in a 110-inch wheelbase format, but it wasn't long before a short wheelbase 90-inch option was introduced. When the car was launched, it was a great success at home and abroad, and it proved to be very competitive. In fact, this updated 4x4 design helped to ensure that Land Rovers remained a favourite with the world military. By the middle of the year, 90% of Land Rover production was destined for the Third World for use by the armed forces. When the four-door Range Rover was launched, the company's success increased tenfold, with no one prepared for the incredible sales it achieved in a very short space of time. By early 1984, the car represented nearly 80% of the company's total sales. In fact, it was so popular that hardly anyone in Britain still bought the two-door version, and consequently it was discontinued a year later. Even the US market took to the stylish new Range Rover, with customers importing them before they'd officially gone on sale stateside. With the future appearing to be set fair, and the interest in Range Rover growing in the USA, the company focused its attention on a full-scale launch in America. The cars that were exported to the States were the most luxurious models that had ever been produced in the Solihull factory, fitted with an all-leather interior air conditioning, cruise control and automatic transmission. With an asking price of a whopping $60,000, the Range Rover was nearly treble that of the homegrown Ford Explorers and Jeep Cherokees, but money proved to be no object. This luxurious, classic 4x4 became an American status symbol as quickly as it had become a British one, as celebrities flocked to buy them. In fact, the American elite helped the car sales climb to unprecedented heights, and once again, Rover struggled to meet demand. Meanwhile, back at company HQ in Solihull, the directors were so pleased with the Range Rover's success over the past 2 decades that they decided to expand the Land Rover range by creating a junior Range Rover. In 1989, a brand new Land Rover was launched called the Discovery, combining all the stylish lessons learned from the Range Rover with the practicality of the classic Land Rover. Just like its Japanese rivals, the new car came with a rear-mounted spare wheel and a large side-opening rear door, as well as many other features that were pure Land Rover. When it was launched, it was only available in a 2-door format, so that it wouldn't encroach on sales of the Range Rover, and customers were given a choice of engine. They could either have the 3.5-litre V8 or a brand new award-winning TDI direct injection turbo diesel that was developed almost entirely in-house. This car proved to be the ultimate leisure 4x4 vehicle, as not only was it luxurious and modern, but also had the off-road capabilities of a Range Rover. Consequently, within barely a year, the Discovery sales exceeded all of the Rover Group's expectations. So much so that in 1990, the 4-door version was announced, further helping the car to become known as the world's best family 4x4. As the company struggled to keep up with the demand for their new car, they wisely remembered the rest of the Land Rover range. In fact, the Land Rover 90, 110 and 127 variants were given the infamous 2.5-litre TDI engine, and at the same time, these workhorse cars became known as Defenders in recognition of their incredible popularity with the military. By the end of 1992 in America, the success of the Range Rover led to the export of the all-purpose Defender range. As a result, 500 US specification Defender 110s were built, costing a staggering $38,000, but again they sold out immediately. Sensing an overwhelming demand for Land Rover products, dedicated Land Rover centres appeared right across America, with each one specialising in the full range. With US spec Defender 90s now permanently on the market, in 1994 the car was named winner of the Best of What's New award in the American magazine Popular Science. When BMW took over the Rover Group in 1994, the Land Rovers and Range Rovers were the high flyers of the company, and the new management was immediately forced to increase production to keep up with demand. Yet despite the fact that BMW were already swamped with orders, they nevertheless decided it was a good time to release a new generation of Range Rover. The proposed design retained many of the classic styling points of the original, but also featured a variety of electronic gadgets, a new engine, plus a classic leather and walnut trim interior. Despite being pitched against the likes of Mercedes and Jaguar, the modernised Range Rover sold well, but because of its move up market, the majority of the people who bought it chose not to drive it off-road, despite its legendary capabilities. As a result, unlike its predecessor, the second-generation Range Rover became known as an on-road car with off-road option. As was to be expected, the launch of this new Range Rover meant that sales of the original started to tumble, and in 1995 they declined to such a degree that BMW decided to stop production. It was indeed the end of an era, because during its lifetime no other 4x4 had such worldwide appeal, and thanks to its amazing design, over 70% of these all-time classics are still in use around the world today. Meanwhile, the Discovery models were starting to look old compared to the competition. To deal with this problem, BMW decided to create a new, smaller Land Rover model, hoping that this too would be a success in the ever-growing leisure market, named the Freelander. When it went on sale, the Freelander proved to be a brilliant leisure sports utility vehicle, and just like the rest of the Land Rover range, it was an instant hit, but more than ever with Britain's younger car drivers. In fact, it was so popular that on Land Rover's 50th birthday in 1998, the new small 4x4 joined the rest of the Land Rover range, the Defender, the Discovery, and the Range Rover in the company's Hall of Fame. From a post-war stopgap to a motoring legend, the Land Rover and Range Rover brands weathered every storm the 20th century could throw at them and emerged triumphant to power into the new millennium and beyond. Land Rover had been born out of necessity, and its success was a result of constantly moving with the times, keeping pace with customer demand. It has, of course, also had its fair share of lucky breaks, none more so than in 2001, just after Ford had acquired Land Rover from BMW. The writing appeared to be on the wall for the Defender, which was looking rather dated. But when the heroine of Tomb Raider drove a new V8 version in a major Hollywood movie that was seen by millions, sales rocketed. With such a commitment still to designing and producing vehicles that the general public finds so desirable, whether farmers, service personnel, or busy families at leisure or about town, there's a Land Rover product to suit every need, although not necessarily every pocket. Quality has always come at a price, and as this programme has shown on numerous occasions, in the luxury Range Rover market, prestige is the most important consideration. Equally, the reliability and durability of the Land Rovers will always prove to be a worthy investment. Sadly, our time enjoying the delights of these classic vehicles is rapidly drawing to a close. But we do just have a few moments to take a last look at the Land Rovers and Range Rovers that have gone down in the history of the British car industry as all-time greats. The nostalgia of seeing the Land Rover Series 1 will thrill every enthusiast. And the Series 2s, 2As, and Series 3s that followed in this pioneering vehicle's footsteps will always be a pleasure to watch. However, if luxury is more in keeping with personal taste, who could fail to take pleasure from being reminded of the early Range Rovers and that ultimate style machine, the Vogue Special Edition? These treasures from the past will always receive a warm reception, but the success of the Land Rover brand has always been built on looking to the future. Therefore, seeing the Discoveries, Defenders, and even more contemporary Freelanders offers great promise for the future from these multi-function vehicles that will always be much, much more than a mere mode of transportation, wherever in the world you happen to want to go.